I'm going to be kind of not talking about archaeology again this week. I have a good reason, though. I want to talk about Celtic languages. I have to admit I'll sort of be muddling my way through this. A linguist I am not. Celtic languages, though, there are 6 of them still spoken today. Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Manx Gaelic, Welsh, Breton, which is the language of Brittany or the Armorica Peninsula in northwestern France, and Cornish. Cornish is from Cornwall, the extreme southwest of England. And it's interesting because all of the Celtic languages have struggled and their numbers of speakers have dwindled tragically. Cornish, though, actually stopped being spoken completely, I believe, a number of centuries ago. Since then, though, there has been a revitalization movement that has brought it back into speech, which is really incredible. I know the most, though, about the Irish language because I speak a little bit. Irish is interesting because there actually are some ways in which it's very different from other European languages. Word order, for example. This can be kind of mind-boggling if you haven't thought about it before. Word orders seem so natural and innate to our grammar, to the way we make sense of words. In English, we have a subject, verb, object word order. I have to think about that for a second. So to say I eat bread, I have to say I first, which is the subject, eat, which is the verb, second, and last comes bread, the object. And they have to go in that order for the sentence to make sense. That's the same for other Germanic languages and the Romance ones, like if you speak French or Spanish. If in Italian you say I eat bread, it's io mangio pane, same thing. Subject, verb, object. Although in Italian you can actually just drop the subject, but that's a different story. Anyway, in Irish, it's different. It's verb, subject, object. If anyone watching happens to speak Irish, I'm going to put it out there right now that I know this doesn't say I eat bread. What it does say is ahan on loan na posh tea. Ahan is the verb, eats. On loan means the lion, and that's the subject. Na posh tea means the children, and that's the object. So, directly translated, this sentence would read as eats the lion, the children, which is complete gibberish in English, but if you read in Irish it makes sense. It would properly translate as the lion eats the children. This morbid sentence brought to you by Duolingo. I don't know if the word order thing is characteristic of all Celtic languages. It could be, might not. One of the parts of the Celtic languages you'll hear about most, though, if you look into the literature, is the sounds. The Celtic languages have certain sounds that just don't show up in English, like the ch sound in Irish, or Welsh has a hl sound. There's this whole big thing about P and Q sounds in the Celtic languages, though. There are certain words that in Latin have a Q in them, like the number 4. I imagine the Latin numeral 4 is quator, but I didn't actually check that, so don't quote me. Now, it seems that the Celtic languages picked up on some of these words, and that in some cases they kept that Q sound. In English we would probably call it a K sound, k. Other times, though, the Celtic languages changed that Q sound into a P. So in Irish, what we call 4 is ceathair, with that k sound, and in Welsh it's pedair, with the P. You might be pronouncing the Welsh wrong. For that matter, my Irish pronunciation might be off as well, but I think you get the idea. Some people have used this Q-P split to try to make sense of how all the Celtic languages are related to each other. This is a pretty standard tree of that relationship. What this is saying is that there was once a single language ancestral to all the Celtic languages. It's called Proto-Celtic here. I think proto means first, like prototype, but that's another thing you probably shouldn't quote me on. At some point, Proto-Celtic speakers split, and some of them wound up speaking Goidelic, which is where the Gaelic languages, Irish, Manx, and Scottish come from. The rest of them spoke something else. Some of those guys wound up speaking Celt-Iberian, which was spoken in the ancient Iberian Peninsula, what's now Spain and Portugal. The rest of them, again, spoke something else that we don't really know. And this splitting happened a couple more times. And down at the bottom, we have Gaulish. Gaul was what the Romans called a large part of what's now France. And then we had Brythonic, which is the source of Welsh and Breton and Cornish. These guys are off on their own down here, farther from everyone else, because they're the P-Celtics. There is other evidence than just the PQ split, but Honestly, I'm boiling this down a lot because I don't entirely understand all of it. As I said, a linguist I am not, so I'm not even going to try to explain where this model comes from, but there is another model of how the Celtic languages are related. This one, the person who did it, I think his name was McCone, wasn't as certain about how the Celt-Iberian and Gaulish languages, and he doesn't have Lepontic, which was on the last model, how they're related to Proto-Celtic, but his big thing was that he didn't think that Brythonic, or the British languages, and Goidelic, which were essentially Irish-originating languages, were as distantly related as the other model said. Now, this has a really interesting implication for archaeology, because this model would imply that there was once a single group that spoke a single language, most likely living in Britain and Ireland, that led to the Irish and British Celtic languages now spoken in Britain and Ireland. That's very different from the last model, where Old Irish is supposed to be really old, and then Brythonic is on this other branch completely, which would seem to imply that there were two separate lineages of Celtic speakers that somehow wound up in Britain and Ireland. Now, the thing about that is what archaeological implications can we actually draw out of this? It's really tempting to just equate languages with peoples. It's something people have done, kind of like just thinking that archaeological cultures, like I talked about earlier, are just simple indications of what we call peoples. But this comes back to that whole big idea I've had about what is a people. Can we really conflate a language with a people? Because a language doesn't really equal an identity, and if we think of a people as an identity, that doesn't really make sense. Like, saying a Celt is simply a Celtic language speaker, or a Brythonic Celt is just a Brythonic Celtic speaker, would be like saying that German indicates all the Canadian English speakers and American English speakers and Australian and New Zealand English speakers, along with all the English in England and the English speakers in Cornwall and Wales and Scotland and Ireland, and all the people that speak other Germanic languages, like the Scandinavian languages and, German itself. Also, through time, because Germanic isn't a single language or just a family of languages that exists at a single moment. It has a time depth, pretty long time depth, going back thousands of years. Does the label German actually describe all those peoples as a single group? Is that actually a useful thing to have a name for? And if that's all that Celt really means, is that a useful term? That's one of those big ideas things I'm going to leave you with for now. I have one other thing I wanted to touch on, though, this week. Back in the day, Celtic linguistics was really tied up in this whole Celt started out in Central Europe and spread out from there theory. More recently, there's a fairly prolific archaeologist named Barry Cunliffe who's been pushing pretty hard that Celtic originally showed up along the Atlantic seaboard of Europe. Cunliffe sees the Atlantic as having connected the peoples living along it for basically millennia, and thinks that that's where Proto-Celtic came from. I'm not going to elaborate on that too much, although I think he has some great ideas. I tend to agree with him. He has some good books. Check out Celtic from the West, which he edited with John Coach. What I'm actually going to say about this, though, is that I had an instructor once who, in his interpretation of what Cunliffe has said, basically thought that Proto-Celtic had showed up as a trade language along the Atlantic coasts of Europe. Now, I sort of know what he meant. The thing is, although I'm going to admit here I really haven't heard other people other than this one guy say this, but I just kind of wanted to dispel this idea because I have some pretty strong thoughts about it. A trade language sort of implies something in particular. For example, where I live, there is a trade language that is indigenous to these lands I've settled on called Chinook Wawa. And Chinook Wawa is a pidgin, which means it's kind of amalgamated from a bunch of different languages, a bunch of different language families, and that there aren't really any native speakers of it. It's also fairly simple. It's simple to learn, because that way it was useful as a trade language. There wasn't that much it had to do, and lots of people could pick it up quickly. Is that really what Proto-Celtic was? I don't think so. Proto-Celtic probably wasn't a pidgin. I don't know of any linguists that look at it and think it was amalgamated from a bunch of other languages, or think that the now derived living Celtic languages came from a language that was built in such a way. It also would imply that there were probably a bunch of other languages along the Atlantic coast that would create the need for a trade language to be able to communicate among the people living along the communities, because they couldn't communicate in their own languages. I don't think that's really what Proto-Celtic was. It may be a bit of a half-baked idea. I don't know if I articulated myself well there, but I think it's something to think about. If anyone else in the world comes across this idea that Celtic is a trade language, I'd love to hear what someone else thinks about it. I'm skeptic about it, but we'll hear if anyone else has some ideas, or you'll just hear from me next week.